Welcome back to Family Twist. If you listened to part one of Brad Ewell's story, you know we left you hanging on a huge moment. One that completely rewrote everything Brad thought he knew about his life.
Yeah, let's recap real quick. Brad grew up never questioning his identity. Then, a simple DNA test set off a chain of events that led to a message from a stranger, a birth certificate that didn't add up, and a phone call with his father that ended in complete silence. And then, finally, the words no one expects to hear, "Bradley, you're adopted, and we've been trying to figure out how to tell you."
Talk about a gut punch. But here's the thing. Brad's story doesn't stop there. Because as he started unpacking the past, the secrets just kept piling up. And one of them, it had been sitting right in front of him his whole life.
Imagine lying in a hospital bed, about to go into surgery for thyroid cancer, and hearing your mother say, "Cancer doesn't run in our family," when in reality, she knew she wasn't actually biologically related to you. That would have been the perfect time to tell the truth, right? But instead, she kept it locked away.
Okay, let's get back to Brad's unpacking the shocking discovery of secrets and lies.
It was just a lie to compound the other lies. I mean, I was 49 years old. I had had cancer in my 30s. My wife and I had struggled through infertility and IVF when we were trying to have kids. I can look back and see a litany of times where wouldn't have been a fun time to tell me that I'm adopted in the middle of us going through infertility, but it would have opened up the opportunity to be like, we had this same problem, and here's what we did, and we probably should have told you before. I even remember one of the things that has stuck in my head was I had thyroid cancer I think I was 38. And I was laying in the pre-op room, all in my little gown with my hairnet on, and my mom and my dad are there, and my kid, I guess I would have had two kids back then. My two kids and my wife were there. And my mom, out of the blue, goes, "This is just so strange. Cancer doesn't run in our family."
Okay.
And so, once again, one of those times to say, but maybe we need to talk about your medical history. But no. My personal belief, and I'll never know, they're both passed now, and it was nothing they would ever admit to. They were taking that to their grave. I was never going to learn that from them.
What's funny, another guest on Family Twist said to me recently, Corey wasn't able to be on that episode, but he urged us to do a Family Twist episode about shame. And I think it's so sad that your mom felt shame about her own situation, and obviously felt it about yours as well, and it was a different time. I totally get
100%.
that. Totally get that. But my hometown was so small. My parents used to joke and say, we couldn't have kept it from you even if we wanted to. They didn't want to, but like everybody knew I was adopted. So, it wasn't like they acquired me and then moved to that town. They were in that town, so that baby just showed up,
Well, yeah. And see, I think that's one of the things that helped my parents dodge that bullet was when my parents adopted me, they were living, and this turns into this whole not long, but a gray market adoption story of they were living in Chicago. He was flying for American Airlines. My mom wanted to come back to Dallas because that's where her mom and dad were. So the plan all along had been for them to return to Dallas and be based in Dallas. But they were living in Chicago. My bio mom, by, all the magic of serendipity in the world, shows up at Dr. Carmichael's clinic, a family friend of my parents, who my parents had told, we can't have kids and we might consider adopting one. So my bio mom shows up pregnant with a kid that she wants to give up, tells Dr. Carmichael, I want to give up this kid. Dr. Carmichael calls my parents in Chicago and says, hey, did y'all want to adopt a baby? Because if you do, I think I have one. And that's how all that transpired. But when they adopted me, they were in Chicago. Now, that wasn't technically legal back then. They actually had a fake nursery in my grandparents' house in Dallas that whenever they came to do the check-ins on me that they had to do, they would fly back and put me in this nursery and claim they lived there. But then after 7 or 8 months of having me, they moved back to Dallas, and it was a pilot, a flight attendant, and a new baby showing up in town, nobody asked where I came
Yep.
from. That was just assumed.
Yep.
So there wasn't any work to keep the secret.
Mhm.
I say that the part that surprises me is I didn't find out till probably 2-ish years after I found out I was adopted. Literally everybody else, grandparents, aunts, uncles, all of those people knew I was adopted, and nobody slipped for 49 years, which is impressive to me.
It is. I mean, it's hard. I don't want to judge people, but it's like, the secrecy and that's hard to justify. But, and I find myself, and I don't know how you feel about your adoptive grandparents, but in my situation, I'm disgusted with both sets of my biological grandparents for never, like admitting it, saying, I wish they had slipped up. You know what I mean? Like, I wish,
Yeah.
because they kept it so secret. I was such a dirty little secret. And that makes me angry often.
Oh, absolutely.
They're all gone. There's nobody to be angry at. So it's really futile, but it's still real.
My uncle, my dad's brother, my adoptive dad's brother's first wife, because she'd always been nice and we'd kind of kept in touch even after they divorced. And I reached out to her one day and said, I've got a really weird question for you. Did y'all know that I was adopted? And her first response was, "Oh my God, they never told you?" And I was like, "No, not." She had assumed that somebody had told me at some point. Now, by then, all the adoptive grandparents had long passed, but the ones that were closer in age to my parents had all assumed that, oh, he must know by now. So she was as surprised as I was to know that I didn't know. But you're right. It does lead to, there's some legitimate anger behind secrets there.
Right. And I wonder, I'm sure you've thought about this, Brad, that how different would your relationship be with your adoptive mother if that secret wasn't there and her secret about maybe being adopted wasn't there?
That is one of those things that will haunt me probably for my rest of my life, because I think that we could have had a much better relationship. My mom had some serious issues that she needed help with that she never got help with. But to this day, I feel like I could have understood her better had I understood that she couldn't have a kid of her own. I feel ultimately there are some very narrow different situations. But like for my parents, I don't believe they wanted to adopt a child. They wanted to have a biological child and they couldn't. So at the best, I'm a consolation prize to that.
Mhm.
And it's not a pity party for me. And then you add into that, she was a very insecure person.
Mhm.
And I look at pictures of like newly adopted babies and I think of my own 3 kids. Even though I was biologically their father, there were times that nobody in the world could calm them down but my wife. There came a point where all the rocking, all the singing, all the things I could do didn't fix it. And the minute they got in their mom's arm, they were dead asleep. Well, what happens in that same scenario when you're a person that's insecure and desperately needs approval, and that baby is not going to calm down for you because you are not who that baby is looking for? That just compounds that pain that you're already dealing with. It was a different time, but people needed therapy back then too, and nobody went. So then you get the one thing in the world you want, and that thing kind of rejects you. And through no fault of anybody, it's just
No.
biology. I was looking for the place that I had known for 9 months, and there was this person that wouldn't let me go. I still remember when my kids were little, if you didn't eventually give them to your mom, it went from I'm upset and crying to I am furious until I get where I want to go.
Yeah. You made me think of something that now my adoptive mother seemed very in touch with her emotions, but I remember as I got older and after she had passed away, my adoptive dad would tell me that she had some strange feelings about the fact that she couldn't breastfeed me, because and well, it was compounded by the fact that it took months for them to find a suitable formula. In fact, my weight kept fluctuating and I got below weight and, that sort of thing. And which made them both feel guilty. Like,
Yeah.
we're not giving this child what he needs, but they were doing the very best they could. But my mother had, I think, real guilt associated with being unable to, quote, provide, nourishment to me as a baby. And I'll never know how that feels, but
No.
I can only imagine how, because to your point, my parents had tried and it had 3 miscarriages, before they ever
Okay.
decided to adopt. That was apparently torturous for both of them, I'm sure, but my mother was really
Well,
affected by that.
my wife had 3 miscarriages before we had our first kid, or our
Yep.
2 before our first kid, and then 1 after our first kiddo. So I mean, it's brutal on everybody. My adoptive parents were the opposite. Dad had mumps when he was a kid and made him infertile.
Yep.
So it was just a no-go from the beginning.
Did your mother know that? So I mean, she was going into a relationship.
I don't know if either of them knew until they tried. I don't know if that was, we were trying and it's not working, what's happening, and then they go, oh, well, he had the mumps and he's infertile now.
Mhm.
But what I think Corey said, and I think Kendall, you said it too, there's that shame element there. Before my dad was an airline pilot, he was a Navy fighter pilot. He was a football star. So back in those days, well, that you don't want to admit that you can't have babies. You're this manly man. Of course you can have babies.
Right.
So I think there was really shame and pain for both of them that they never worked through.
Absolutely. I mean, my dad would say to me too, like, I felt successful in so many ways in my life, but I wasn't able to help my wife have a child,
Yeah.
not because he was infertile. He just, as a couple, they couldn't make it happen. It was super important to them.
That's a heavy burden.
Yeah. And, God love them. They were married for 17 years before they got me. So, I mean, that's a long time to want a child and not have a
Yes.
child. Just tragic, I think.
So, Brad, how soon after your father admitting, yes, you were adopted, did you start thinking about, like, okay, well, where did I come from? Who are my people? Who are my biological parents?
So that's one of the spots where it's both good and bad. I did not have the discovery journey so many adoptees and DNA surprise people have because the person that found me was my bio mom's sister. So much of the mystery that everybody else is trying to solve was handed to me immediately, which is great because you don't have to search for it, but it's also like drinking out of a fire hose. Sometimes it's a whole lot to take in all at once. The night that I found out, I mean, probably the most guy thing to do and the worst way to do it, but I knew I was doing everything I could because I was at work and I'm like, I have to work another 5 hours and I've just found out I'm adopted and I've got to get it back together for 5 more hours. So I can't call my wife on the phone because I'm going to break down and start crying and it is not going to stop for 5 hours and that can't happen. So I sent my wife a text and I was like, hey, funny story. That woman that's been messaging us is right. I just found out I'm adopted. I cannot talk to you on the phone right now because I've got to get my head together. But please let her know. And anything you want to find out, I would love because you're my safe place. You can be my conduit of information. This other person, even though technically now she's my aunt, I don't know her. You, I know, and you are a safe place for me to get information from. So you find out everything you can. And you can kind of dole it out to me as I'm ready to hear little bits and pieces more. So that was how we started the journey. I allowed the doling out to happen for maybe an hour because once I started finding out, I was like, well, I can't not know this. And finally I was like, hey, just let me see your phone with all the messages on it. And even she was like, I don't think you're ready for this yet. And I'm like, I know, but I can't not know anymore. So just let me just read them all. And she was right. I was so unprepared for where we were headed. So, I mean, the day after I was told I was adopted, I knew everything about my biological family except a 100% certainty of who my biological father was. But my aunt was very certain about who she believed my biological father was,
Yeah.
and still had contact information for him. So there was not a lot of mystery.
Mine happened, listeners will know, but mine happened so similarly too. I mean, the day I found my brother, he told me this is my father's son. He told me the name of my birth mother in our first 30 seconds of speaking on the phone. And of course, that didn't mean anything to me. And she had such a common name that I was like, okay, great. This is going to take me forever to find, but it didn't. And because within 3 weeks, I had found both sides of the biological family. So it can happen quickly. And
Mm-hmm.
for listeners who want things to happen quickly, but both Brad and I can say that it's tough. It's tough. It's a lot to take in, even if, in my instance, I wanted to learn. Right? This wasn't quite the surprise that Brad you had, but it's still. My adopted parents have been gone for 30 years, and I think I had just resigned myself to the fact that I was never going to find.
I actually just had coffee with somebody that I've known for a little while that I found out had just the NPE surprise of dad is not dad. And she's wanting to find biofamily. And we had a long talk over coffee. And I was like, absolutely do it. I can give you the resources to do it. Also be ready that even if it's great, this is a lot to go through.
7 years in, it's not what I thought it was going to be.
No.
It's good, don't get me wrong, but I think I've always been sort of an optimist, and I've also never felt rejection. So I never expected to be treated the way that I've been treated. And probably because I hadn't experienced it before, it pisses me off. Like,
Yeah.
how dare you treat me like that? I'm a good person. That's my approach. And I can't change that feeling. I might never get that. It's my biological mother's family. I'll probably never get all that resolved. Still
Well,
worth it.
I don't think at some point you don't have to resolve being mad about certain things. Because, I mean, when you come at somebody with the idea of, I literally need nothing from you, I'm not trying to get in on inheritance, I don't need anything. All I want to know is who I am and where I came from. How far off do you have to be to not give somebody that?
Yep, I agree. And I admire my half sister, my mother's daughter. She and I have talked a few times about the fact that our grandmother, so my biological maternal grandmother, she lived with my sister and my sister's husband before she died. And I, because of who I am, can't fathom that she didn't say, oh, Stephanie, by the way, you've got a brother out there. You know what I mean? Like that. I, I admire my sister for not harboring resentment toward her because
Yeah.
I would, because my sister and I love each other so much and we're so happy to have found each other. And I think to myself, we could have found each other sooner, but maybe we couldn't have without the DNA help. But maybe we would have tried the DNA thing earlier or as early as possible.
Well, and I mean, I do think that weighs heavily on people. I went from such a small family to such an enormous family. I still don't think I've met everybody yet, but I've met almost all the people physically close to me. So almost all the aunts and uncles, bio mom had already passed, but I'd met all these people. The very last person that was willing to meet me was my bio mom's husband, who had been married to her for 30 years before she passed.
Wow.
And his holdup was he was brokenhearted that she kept a 30-year secret from him. They shared everything, and he never knew that she gave up a baby for adoption before they met.
Mm-hmm.
And he really struggled with the fact that she was willing to keep that from him. And I mean, she's already passed. There's no reconciliation for him with that.
Right. At least my mother's husband knows about me. I guess that's one thing. But yeah, it's just, we talk a lot about secrecy and lies, and now I feel like the third theme is the shame. And
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, it's sad, that my biological mother's 70 years old and she's been carrying this, for 54 years. It's just sad.
Oh,
But
it breaks my heart. My sister, who I'm probably got the closest to of everybody, she passed this year, or no, last year, because it's 2025 now. As she and I were getting to know each other, one of the first things she said was, "Everything makes so much more sense now." She was diagnosed as a teenager with something called polythysemia vera, which is a weird rare blood disease, which basically means you can't have kids. What it turns out was she was misdiagnosed. She actually had ovarian cancer that if they caught much earlier, she would have survived, but they didn't. For her whole life, our mom told her, the reason you can't have kids is a curse brought on by me that I can't tell you about. I mean, she carried that for her whole life, that she made her daughter infertile. Completely illogical. It's absolutely not what happened.
We have not talked about your bio dad yet. And
Okay.
we know
Yeah,
there's a story there, but
there's a whole nother story there.
did you find out in that series of texts who he was?
Yes. So in that series of texts was the information that my bio dad was, or who my aunt believed my bio dad was a man that had been in prison since 1972. And so the cop side of me, I mean, that was probably even the worst thing that could happen, because the cop side of me was like, well, now I have to find out more about that. So I had his name. I don't think I had a birth date then, but I had his name. I knew he had committed murder. So I knew his crime. I knew his name, and I knew where it had happened. So I immediately dove to newspapers.com and went in all the archives and what can I find about this guy? And so, yeah, it turned out that I was a 49-year-old that had been a police officer for 25 years at that point, who had a biological father who'd been in prison for murder since 1972 that I knew nothing about. Or who my aunt seriously believed was my biological father. And part, since we love the family twist theme, part of the part that my aunt does not like to talk about is outside of her reasons for wanting to find me, of being the only person in the family that knew that I ever existed, because they were living in Dallas and the rest of the family was in Stockton when I was born, was her sisters did not believe her assertion that her little sister had had an affair with her husband back when she was married. And my biological father is also my aunt's first husband.
Oh boy.
So that was who she believed my father was. And she turned out to be right. But there was that extra little element in there as well.
Which, again, it's, you had no control over any of that situation, but that shame is sort of brought to you.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, let us kids just be who we are.
Yeah, I mean, we have nothing to do with this. I had no control over who you decided to sleep with, who you decided to marry. That wasn't me. I'm just the product of a lot of those decisions.
Yep. But
I think the crappy part is we are painful reminders for that time. Like to this day, my biological mom died in 2000. I found out in 2019. And do I wish I could have met her? Absolutely. She seemed like an amazing woman. Do I think she ever would have wanted to meet me, knowing that she never told her husband she had a kid? I don't know.
I know.
I can't imagine what that would be like on the flip side, to be living your life one day. You gave up a baby 50 years ago, and all of a sudden that baby's like, hey, do you want to get to know each other now?
Yeah.
And your daughter doesn't know you had a baby before. She just knows you cursed her somehow with infertility, according to you, and your husband doesn't know. I don't know.
It's a lot. Yeah. And some people don't deal well with it,
No.
Yeah.
So being who you are, being a cop, and finding out that your bio dad is in prison for murder, does that make you really hesitant to want to have any contact with him, or does it make you more intrigued to have contact with him?
A little bit of both. It initially made me want to have as limited of contact as I could with him as possible. And that's from we all have our own issues. I've been a cop for 25 years. If you tell me, hey, somebody's done 50 years in prison, I can build a pretty good image of what I think I'm going to meet. And that wasn't really a great picture in my head.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So really, I knew I wanted to know about him. Initially, I didn't know if I was ever going to speak to him. I just knew I wanted to know of him. Then when, and I learned at the same time that my biological mother's deceased, so I know that's going to be a door. People can tell me all about her, but the best I will ever know is other people's descriptions of her, which are all filtered by their own lens of life. So I initially decided that, I'd been a cop, but I hadn't really dealt with a lot, or I'd put a lot of people in prison, but I didn't really hang out with them while they were in prison. So I learned things like people in prison have email. Didn't know that. So I was like, well, email is a fairly safe form of communication where I can reach out and touch you. You can send me things back. With email, if something's hard, I can just close that and walk away and come back tomorrow. So that was my decision. I was like, well, I'll email this guy and we'll talk, and that's perfect.
So at this point, did you know whether your biological father knew that you even existed?
Nope.
Oh, you didn't know
Well,
which way?
I didn't initially, and then one of the things that will always be a struggle for my aunt and I is I pretty quickly found out that because she wanted proof that her sister had slept with her husband/ex-husband, she had reached out to him and given him all of my info, like my full name, my date of birth, trying to get him to admit to conceiving me with her sister.
Okay.
He did not know of me. He did not know I existed. He did not know my bio mom. He knew my bio mom was pregnant. He did not know it was his. He didn't know he had another son out there. That was all news to him.
So how do you even start an email?
So I was doing my writing the other day and I just rewrote this. The first line of my email was, this is probably going to be as weird for you to read as it is for me to write it. But I think you may be my father. And I'm just trying to explore that. I mean, I'm not trying to be crass, but he's in prison. I don't need anything from you. You've been in prison for 50 years. I'm just trying to figure out if you are. And if you are, I'm just kind of curious about you. And his first email response was very generic in general. And I don't blame him a bit now, knowing that my aunt had already reached out to him. And he said, I knew your mom. Yes, your mom and I spent some time together. I did not know that I had another kid out there. You absolutely could be my son, but I have no way to know if you are or not. And just very honest about it. And so, I was like, okay. I guess it was my aunt had sent me some older pictures of him, both early on in prison, later through his years in prison. And I had a picture from me, and I can send this to you if y'all want to add it to the show notes. But I had a picture of me, I think at 46, 47. And I had a picture of him at about that same age. So I cropped those two pictures, put them side by side, sent that to him in the next email and said, I don't know if this helps, but here's a picture of you and I at about the same age. And his next email back was, well, hello, son. It's nice to meet you. Well, I wasn't ready for that. I shut that email and I didn't talk to him for a month. My brain was not at all prepared for acknowledging that reality that I was poking around at. So he took to it immediately, and I immediately went into panic mode and was like, oh, no, we're not going there yet.
Yeah. But I mean, I think about somebody in his position, that probably was amazing for him to get to meet you, even electronically.
For a couple reasons, I think it was because I do have a half brother from his side, and they had been out of contact for quite a while. They'd had a pretty big falling out. So he really didn't have, he had his sister who was out here who was mentally declining health wise. She has dementia. And his ex wife, that was my half brother's mom, had been remarried. He hadn't really kept in touch with my bio mom. So he didn't really have a lot of people out here other than just, some old friends. So I do think to have some kind of biological family contact was huge for him.
Because I can't stand to be in a small room. I can't imagine being imprisoned. So, you know what I mean? Like, that's just, to me, that was a lifeline for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So who made the next contact after that?
After about a month, I reached back out. And I think he had sent me a couple emails in the meantime. It's the way the prison email works. It's a completely separate email system. So I had to go into this other app to look at it. So when I finally went back, I had a couple others from him, and I apologized, was just upfront and said, that was just a lot for me to take in. So we started emailing back and forth. And then what really kicked things off for me was Lester Holt did a Dateline special on Angola State Penitentiary, which is where my father was in prison. And I had come to a conclusion that I was really pretty happy with him as a concept. Like, I know he's biologically my father. I've emailed with him. I've gotten to know some things about him. I've never seen him. I've never heard his voice. That was really a pretty comfortable place for me. That was a really safe box to put him in and keep him there. I had pretty much decided we weren't going to talk on the phone. I wasn't going to see him. This was a solid way to get to know this man that I wasn't sure I wanted to know that much anyway, and keep him like I couldn't imagine building a relationship with him just out of fear of losing somebody else at this point. My mom and dad were still very much my mom and dad, but with those surprises, everything is so different all of a sudden. There was so much loss in that. The idea of, okay, so if I get to know this guy and I hate him, I lose him. If he doesn't like me, I lose him. If he just stops talking to me, there's nothing I can do. So it was really scary to try to get to know him. And then I don't know if you have content warnings on your thing. So once again, edit me if you want to. And he actually, you don't have to edit this out because I've emailed him and he knows this. But I always for quite a while, I called him fucking Lester Holt because Lester Holt did this special on Dateline, and my buddy tells me about it and I watch it. And that's the last time I sleep for 3 days. And I'm like, oh, the wheels came off the bus. I had the wheels really solidly on the bus, and this has really screwed things up because something about seeing, like, I knew, prison movies, you were talking about being claustrophobic. Just about every movie prison you see, it is a 2-man cell with bars on this run. He had told me he was living in a 90-man dormitory. It basically looks like an army barracks. But there were 90 guys that slept in this barracks. So as I'm watching Lester Holt's special, I'm seeing a 90-man barrack, and I'm starting to wonder, is my father in there? And I'm seeing him and don't know it's him. He lived for 3 days in Angola, talked to people, wandered around. They filmed everywhere. So I'm watching this whole thing wondering, did I see my father? Did I not see my father? And suddenly this really safe concept box I had him nailed down in, he was creeping out of all the seams of the box. So no sleep for 3 days. I called our employee assistance hotline, talked to a therapist, and was like, I need to talk to somebody because I have some things going on. So off to therapy I went, and it was probably 6 weeks, maybe 3 months in that, I went and I told my therapist, what I'm really trying to figure out is, do I want to meet my biofather? We can hash through the secrets and the pain of all that later. The decision I'm trying to make is, do I want to meet this man? And about 6 weeks, just maybe a little bit longer in, we were talking one day and she said, okay, so I think the best way for you to look at this question is, you've told me he's had a heart attack in his 60s that he survived. He's 77, I think, at this point. Regardless, he's 75. He's getting up there in age. He's already had a heart attack. He's lived in prison for 50 years, which is not, the grandstand of healthy environments to keep going into old age in.
Yeah.
If you found out he died tomorrow, are you okay that you never met him? P.S. Remember, you're never going to meet your mom. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not okay. She's like, well, then you have your answer. So I go from I'm never going to meet this guy, I'm never going to talk to him on the phone, to now I've got to call him on the phone to try to schedule to meet with him. And so that I emailed him and said, listen, I think we need to talk on the phone. So he had suggested the phone so many times before that, and I'm sure I had not artfully dodged. I mean, I dodged them all. It was not artful. It was always like, I don't think we want to do that yet. So, when I told him I wanted to talk on the phone, he was all for it because he'd been trying to do that the whole time. So we talk on the phone, and I tell him, I think I do think I want to come see you and meet you. And he said, that's great. So, what do I need to do to get on your visitor list? And he's like, well, it's really easy. I just need your full name, your date of birth, social security number, your driver's license number, your address. And I'm sitting there doing this list in my head of things I'm not giving to anybody, especially not somebody I don't really know in prison. So I guess visitation's out. And at the same time, I'm wondering, is this a scam? Does he really need all of this? I can't imagine this is what you need to go to visit somebody in prison. So I called the prison and I said, hey, I want to get on this guy's visitors list. What do I have to do? And they're like, well, you fill out this form, put you on the list. I'm like, okay, send me the form. Well, it was almost as lengthy of a background packet as I had to fill out to get hired as a police officer. Wow. So it turned out it was one of the first clues that literally everything he told me he needed was on these forms. So I was like, okay, so he wasn't full of it. This was all stuff he needed, and he was really just trying to help. And I mean, he even mentioned it in our first meeting. He's like, I know you were kind of standoffish with me, and I bristled thinking I was not standoffish, but I absolutely was standoffish because this guy in prison's asking me for all this personal info that I'm like, no. So I fill out my packet. And to this day, I have never been more excited to receive an acceptance letter than I was to get my acceptance letter to Angola State Penitentiary, which I don't understand why that should have ever been exciting.
Brad, your story just keeps unfolding in the most unbelievable ways. It's one thing to find out your biological father is a stranger you've never met, but to learn that he's been in prison for murder your entire life, that's something else entirely.
And then to add another twist, he was once married to your aunt? That's next level. I mean, we always say we love a good family twist, but this is a plot twist worthy of a crime thriller.
And I can't stop thinking about the weight of all this, the secrecy, the shame, the fact that so many people knew but never told you. That's a lot to carry.
And now you're faced with a choice. Do you reach out to a man who's been behind bars for nearly 50 years? A man who had no idea you even existed? Or do you keep your distance and let the past stay buried?
And of course, because it's you, Brad, you didn't take the easy route. You made a choice, and that choice led you straight inside one of the most notorious prisons in the country.
That's right, folks. In the final part of our conversation, Brad walks into Angola prison to meet his biological father face to face. And trust us, you do not want to miss what happens next.
Brad, thank you for sharing this part of your journey with us. And to our listeners, we'll be back soon with the unforgettable conclusion of the story. Stay tuned.